If Obsession unsettled you, not because of the horror, but because of what it says about love, then you need to watch Vertigo, because both films argue something deeply uncomfortable. Wanting someone intensely is not the same as loving them. Hi, and welcome to If You Liked, where we take one movie that you liked and suggest another movie that you might like. This time we're looking at Curry Barker's 2026 Obsession, and if you like that film, then there's another film you absolutely need to watch next. Vertigo, from 1958, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. Not because they share jump scares or pacing or aesthetics, they very much don't, but because they share a specific, very uncomfortable idea. Wanting someone intensely is not the same thing as loving them. And when men mistake control for love, women pay the price. So today I want to walk through why Obsession and Vertigo are emotionally connected and why Vertigo is the perfect follow-up if you were fascinated by the way Obsession treats romantic idealization. This whole business of seeing someone as an object of desire rather than a person with autonomy. No spoilers for Vertigo, but definitely spoilers for Obsession. So let's start by reminding ourselves about Obsession. And we've got Bear, who is emotionally stuck, very passive, terrified of rejection, terrified of crossing boundaries, and yet completely consumed by his feelings for Nikki. But he doesn't tell her how he feels. He doesn't risk vulnerability. Instead, he reaches for something emotionally easier, a symbolic act that expresses his desire without requiring vulnerability. And the film turns that symbolic act into literal supernatural danger. He uses the one wish willow to make Nikki love him more than anything in the world. And the wish works. But here's the key. Nikki never chooses it. From that point on, the film basically asks one question. What happens when you try to turn love into possession? We see Nikki's autonomy stripped away. We see her body and mind hijacked by a force that exists purely to serve Bear's wish. And we see Bear confronted with the reality that his dream scenario is actually a nightmare, especially above all for Nikki, the woman he says he loves. And the film is very clear. Bear's problem isn't that he loves or that he loves too much. It's that he doesn't love at all in the real sense. He wants control, certainty, and emotional safety, and he's willing to sacrifice Nikki's agency to get it. So Obsession becomes a kind of moral argument. Possession isn't love, stripping someone of autonomy isn't romantic, and the fantasy of if they just loved me back can very quickly turn into horror. Now, if you liked all those aspects of Obsession, if that's the part of Obsession that grabbed you, the critique of the nice guy fantasy, the horror of love without consent, then Vertigo is your next stop. Let me sketch Vertigo in very broad, spoiler-free terms. So in Vertigo, we meet Scotty, an ex-police detective who becomes intensely fixated on Madeline. She seems fragile, mysterious, almost otherworldly. He's drawn to her in a way that feels less like normal attraction and more like a gravitational pull. He falls in love with her, but Scotty doesn't just fall in love with Madeline, he curates her. He dictates her hair, her clothes, her posture. There's a chilling sequence where he remakes her piece by piece. And here's the important bit. He doesn't fall in love with her as a full person. He falls in love with a version of her that he believes in, whether or not that version is real. He falls in love with a constructed image of her, an idea. And the film slowly reveals how dangerous that is. Not with demons or magic, but with psychology, control, projection, and the urge to remake another human being into your fantasy. So if Obsession uses supernatural horror to show what forced love looks like, Vertigo uses psychological suspense to show what idealized love looks like when it quietly erases Madeleine's autonomy. Same core issue, very different cinematic language. Let's zoom in for a minute on the theme of romantic idealization. The idea that Bear and Scotty don't see Nikki or Madeleine as individuals with autonomy. So in Obsession, Bear's desire for Nikki slides quickly into entitlement. He feels he deserves her love, or at least deserves not to be rejected. Instead of risking for a real conversation, he reaches for a shortcut, magic. Whether or not he believed it would work doesn't matter. He wanted it to work, and that's the point. What Nikki wants is irrelevant to him. Vertigo explores the same slide, but without the supernatural. Scotty's desire becomes a kind of entitlement to a specific version of Madeleine. How she looks, how she behaves, how she fits his fantasy. He doesn't just want her, he wants her in a certain way. In both films, the man's feelings become a justification for overriding the woman's reality. Obsession makes this brutally literal. Nikki becomes literally possessed. She's no longer a subject with her own choices. She's an object animated by Bear's wish. The film even plays with the idea that she's more thing than person at certain points. Vertigo does something similar, but more quietly. Madeleine becomes a symbol of mystery, of beauty, of salvation, of whatever Scotty needs her to be. Her individuality is less important than the role she plays in his emotional story. And in both films, the woman is treated as a solution to the man's inner problem, not as a person with her own inner life. She becomes a cure for the man's anxiety. And when she fails to be that cure, she's reshaped until she fits. Obsession makes that reshaping supernatural. Vertigo makes it psychological. Now, Obsession is very explicit. Nikki's love is not love, it's a curse. Her body and mind are dragged into a state that she never chose, and the film forces us to sit with how horrifying that is. Vertigo doesn't use curses, but it still asks what happens when one person's fantasy completely overrides another person's autonomy. The horror in Vertigo is quieter, but it's the same kind of horror. Love that looks intense from the outside, but is, at its core, non-consensual, because the woman's real self isn't being engaged, only her role in the man's fantasy. So why specifically should someone who liked Obsession watch Vertigo next? Well, for one reason, it deepens the same moral question. Obsession asks, what if you could make someone love you? Would that actually be love? Vertigo asks a related question. What if you could shape someone into your ideal? Would that actually be love? The answer to both questions is no, but Vertigo explores the psychological mechanics in more detail. It shows how projection, fantasy, and control can masquerade as romance. If Obsession is the sharp, modern horror version of the idea, Vertigo is the slow, haunting, analytical version. Secondly, it shows the same problem without magic or the supernatural. One of the powerful things about Obsession is that it uses the supernatural as a metaphor for control. Bear literally conjures a version of Nikki that exists only to serve his wish. Vertigo strips away the magic and says, you don't need a spell or a wish to erase someone's autonomy. You can do it with idealization, with projection, with just refusing to see them as a person. So if you watched Obsession and thought, okay, but what does that look like in real life without the horror tropes? Vertigo is your answer. Thirdly, Vertigo is the classic text on this theme. Vertigo is basically the foundational film about a man who loves a fantasy more than a person. Obsession is part of a newer wave of movies that critique the dynamic in a contemporary context, but Vertigo is the blueprint. If you trace Obsession back far enough, you end up here. Watching Vertigo after Obsession is like going from a sharp modern essay to the original long-form book on the same subject. You start to see how long this problem has been around and how cinema has been wrestling with it for decades. So, if Obsession worked for you, not just as a horror film, but as a critique of the idea that wanting someone badly justifies anything, then Vertigo is absolutely worth your time. Obsession reflects modern anxieties, nice guy entitlement, emotional passivity, magical thinking about romance. Vertigo reflects mid-century anxieties, male control, obsession, and the moulding of women into ideals. You won't get the same aesthetic, but what you will get is the same uncomfortable truth. Love without autonomy isn't love. Desire without respect becomes entitlement. And turning someone into your fantasy is, in the end, violence. Enjoy the movie.